The point that Lord Mayor made a bit earlier about the importance of conventional and Islamic being looked at side by side. I mean, I think we're all old enough on this platform to remember days before the Islamic industry was particularly big and inevitably came from a conventional background into the Islamic industry, in my case about 20 years ago. But I think even my partners who are in this room from our Middle East practice, who are predominantly involved in Islamic finance, inevitably have to deal with conventional work as well. There isn't in any practitioner's stable enough Islamic work to do it solely. You have to do both, and in fact it's helpful to do both because you understand what the risks and liabilities and associated business rationales are behind different types of outcomes for clients. At the end of the day, the banks are all offering outcomes to their customers. So are we kidding people who go into these courses at Islamic institutions, Islamic universities, and coming out with very good theoretical Islamic finance capability? Are we kidding them to think that they can develop a career through academics, through working practice, where they will only be involved in Islamic finance? Or should we be saying to them outright, you are going to be conventional bankers, you are also going to be Islamic bankers. At some point you might be able to specialize one way or another, but don't go into the industry thinking that you can avoid dealing with the conventional. And is that an issue? I mean, in general terms, the kind of way in which these courses are put together, do they focus too much on one side of the business without really taking on the practicalities of the other? And I'd welcome views across the panel.
Well, if I can kick off first, I mean, again, talking about the CISI, we have 900 practitioners who actually effectively build our exams. And they're specifically practitioners because that's the way they share their experience. And when you're talking about whether it's conventional or Islamic, it does very much depend on where the person is working. I think anyone who's working effectively in Malaysia, for example, needs to understand both. Anyone who's working in Guildford in Surrey probably doesn't need to understand both. It depends on where the market is. But the critical point, quite simply, is that you ought to be able to match to your client the correct investment. Otherwise, you're taking into account what the client's looking to find from its return. And if he wants Islamic and you're in an Islamic country, you should be able to offer both that. And they might very well be happy with the conventional. It's up to you to discuss. It's called Know Your Client, if I remember rightly.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think it's very much back to the fundamental of knowledge. I think it will not be that much different between conventional and Islamic finance when it comes to the technical knowledge and things like that. Yeah. But I think that most importantly is that the way or the approach of learning. I think that's very important. Yeah. So when we are taking, for example, a very specific Islamic finance program, doesn't mean that we should ignore to the non-Islamic finance related areas. Okay, this is very important. That's why I think our approach is very much looking into those relevant cases that involve in the learning process. Yeah. So because in order for us to understand the business very well, that is, we should not confine our knowledge within that particular field alone. Yeah? So we have to be broader enough to understand the other elements through the learning process. You may not have the opportunity to practice as conventional bankers or Islamic bankers, but I think your learning process is very important. This is not only to the fresh graduate, but also the practitioners. That's why I think in Malaysia, we have this kind of program we call CPE or CPD, Continuous Development Education or Continuous Development Program, whereby we would like the practitioners to be exposed to different types of knowledge or scenario that will somehow help them in understanding, in appreciating the different kind of practices within the financial service industry. So for me, is that the very important one is that the process of learning that makes someone be equipped with different kind of knowledge and exposures and as well experience to make them more competent in performing their tasks, whether in Islamic finance or in conventional.
Can I press you further on that? You say learning, but do you mean, when you're talking about long-term internships and sandwich courses and so on, are you prepared for these people to be involved in practically, not just making coffee, but getting involved in conventional banking?
Yeah, I think this can be part of the learning, you see. So unfortunately in Malaysia, we have no sandwich kind of program anymore, yeah, because in Malaysia it's all about very fast track kind of education. Last time our bachelor degree program, 4 years, now become 3 years. I don't know, maybe in the future 2.5 years and 2 years. But the thing is that this is the element that we are missing. The internship or apprenticeship, what Datuk mentioned just now, which is very important. That's why I think the Association for the Islamic Finance Professional now, they are developing such program. They call it apprenticeship scheme, 18-month attachment with the industry, so that they will be able to be exposed to different type of activities or dealings within a broader scope of the institution. Again, that is part of the process, as what Nick, you mentioned just now, it's part of the process of learning. Because learning it doesn't mean that you learn at the institution of higher learning, but also when you're really in your profession, when you're really in the practice. So this is a continuous process.
I'm just thinking about that comment the Lord Mayor mentioned about the relevance if you're in Guildford versus Kuala Lumpur. The reality is that there are very few countries where the Islamic system is the only system. I mean, Iran, I think, comes to mind. But most of us live in a dual economy. And even Malaysia, I mean, our Islamic side is no more than about 20%, right? So I think the reality is we may have to look at how does the conventional side train bankers. And if you look at the management training courses that the big banks have, they basically take, graduates and expose them to different parts of the banking cycle to teach them what happens in the whole cycle before they become quote-unquote bankers. And of course, yes, you supplement it by industry exams and so on for the technical knowledge, but really it's a mixture of the two, the exposure to the actual practice and the technical knowledge at the right time so it makes sense. It's the same thing for accountants, right? I mean, we actually prefer people doing exams and working at the same time, not just doing pure exams. The question then is, well, if you take that model, how do you then add that Sharia model? As opposed to what I feel right now is that we seem to front load all the technical knowledge in the university part, which they cannot quite then relate to what they see. And when they actually join business or banks, they find that there's nothing that they're doing in the immediate term that relates to what they've just learned. So again, I think it may go back to the point about, better industry, academia, collaboration.
Is there a need for sort of a stronger vocational training, CPD, CPE process, do you think? I mean, rather than focusing on the front end?
Well, frankly, yes, because I know there's this tendency, particularly among the Gen Ys, that, let's do all my academic bit and then work. Why? Because they want more time when they work to do other things. I get that, but the reality is, I mean, again, like in my profession, you can do a paper on audit, but it means nothing until you're actually in the situation of doing an audit for you to relate to that topic. So many of the things that you have in Islamic finance are very theoretical unless you're actually in that situation, for example, explaining your new investment account product to a customer or perhaps assessing the credit risk on a musharaka loan. It's only then that that technical gels with what you're doing. So personally, I think there's been a lot of good work being done, but I think we need to perhaps do this a bit smarter and perhaps look at existing models. How do we train a lawyer, for example? How do we train an accountant? In this case, how do you train an Islamic banker? The other observation I would have also is that there is this tendency to believe that just because it looks and smells a bit like a conventional instrument, it's haram. It's not. In fact, if you think back to the time, cameras, for example. I mean, I'm quite a fan of cameras. But the Japanese, when they first started making cameras, literally copied Leica, right? And it was a Japanese version of a Leica camera. But as time went on, once they figured out how to make a decent camera, they were then able to innovate it out to the point where there are more Nikons and Canons being sold than Leicas. And I think we have to look again at history and see that point. In other words, it's not wrong to be looking at conventional instruments, but the question is, how do you improve it to meet our needs, rather than rejecting it outright and saying, oh, it's haram, I can't look at it.
Yeah, that's my point about client outcomes. In the end, the banking industry needs to serve the expectations of its clients and develop accordingly. Lord Mayor, you made the point earlier about the need for a more global standard. Of course, that one of the difficulties we have in the industry is that different scholars, different professors in different universities will be telling their students that different things are or are not acceptable or applicable. I mean, how much of that is an issue, Dr. Amat, just quickly, in terms of your accreditation? Do you find that different universities offer different approaches to Islamic finance? Does that create a difficulty for the industry in terms of employing people, knowing that they've been properly educated or that they're open-minded?
I think this is not a big issue to us when it comes to accreditation, because we are looking into, for example, that the disagreement is a very small percentage, the interpretation and things like that, but the rest are almost firm on many ways. Yeah? And sometimes also it's always good to have different views when it comes to the certain situation, because that will really provoke you to think in different ways and things like that. It's not an issue because most of the technical aspects are very similar. So even in our accreditation process, we do appreciate different types of different views from different jurisdictions. This is why we incorporate in our standard, whereby that when it comes to certain areas, we mention that you should conform to your respective requirement in your jurisdiction. Rather than the standard subscribing to a particular school of thought, we make it more generic, saying that this is applicable to the jurisdiction that you are in. Similarly, for example, in terms of regulation requirement, different countries, they have different regulation that, so the standard must say that, you must cover your particular kind of thing. But in the standard also, we mentioned that the different types or different views when it comes to Sharia interpretation and so on, the jurisdiction and kind of thing. The point is that to provide the trainees with the so-called international views. So they are not only looking into their interpretation or their regulation in their particular jurisdiction, but they will also understand how this particular issue being interpreted in different jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. How a particular jurisdiction introduce their kind of regulation that, somehow related to their requirement locally, rather than just subscribe to a particular school of thought.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just bearing in mind the time that we have here, I think that the panel have come to a conclusion generally that there's a need for greater engagement between industry and the educational system. How can that be achieved? Who takes responsibility for forcing it through? I'd be interested to know how it is that people get internships and relevant work experience in the UK finance industry. What forces people to take on interns and sandwich course students, apprentices in the UK? Is it driven from above by regulation? Is it industry need? And I wonder what can be done in Malaysia to achieve the same result. Lord Mayor, what's the view from your point?
Well, I think we're going through a system change at the moment. I think that there's a very clear and rather sad situation where we've got too many graduates underemployed. In other words, they've probably read the wrong subjects at school, they haven't got the right career advice. And I think you'll find that quite a lot of the accountants, if I may say so, and the lawyers now are looking to take people directly from school to go through this apprenticeship process and go back. It's almost like turning the clock back, where we had much more engagement with younger people earlier on, because we found that they're much more job aware and job ready by the time they came out of their period of education. And the problem quite simply at the moment is I think that we are having to recalibrate what we're doing in the UK. We think vocational and professional is effectively fallen behind academic. And it's almost a parental thing that people want their children to be able to say socially their children went to university without really thinking about what they're going to do with their degree afterwards. So yes, we are, but we're looking towards, we're looking now at taking people from school quite often rather than actually taking them from university, because university is not delivering the right, and we have this ridiculous expression, shovel-ready kid coming out. So there is a change taking place. Internships are more difficult because, again, it's about the ability of that company to accommodate internships. Internships do cost money. And so I think I'd prefer to call it an apprenticeship rather than an internship. Internship implies they come in, they work for a bit, and they go away again. And I think the investment the company wants to make is they offer an internship with the ultimate aim of offering that person a job. So it's semantics, I know. What's the difference between apprenticeship and internship? At the end of the day, the company's out there to find bright young kids who will apply themselves quickly and actually can learn. And I think that's the important point.